Let me begin by saying a warm word of welcome on behalf of all the members of the Committee for Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange, as well as myself. Today's event is one that has been long in the planning, and it's a very exciting one for us. So we're very happy to have you here to celebrate with us. In just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Arthur Urbano, who's joining us via Zoom this afternoon. He'll say a few words about the work of our committee. But I want to take just a moment for two brief words before we get started this afternoon. I want to begin by just noting that today is an important holiday in the Catholic calendar, the Feast of All Saints. And I want to take one moment to note some of those most recently added to those who are recognized on this feast day. Last year, Pope Francis took the surprising step of pronouncing an entire Polish family, including mother, father, and their 7 young children, together to be martyrs for the faith. The Ulmas were killed at home by both Nazi troops and local police on March 24th, 1944, together with the 8 Jews that they were hiding at their home after they were apparently betrayed. With them were 70-year-old Saul Goldman and his 4 sons, along with Golda Grunfeld and her sister, Leah Didner, as well as Leah's young daughter. During the ceremony in their Polish village, at which they were declared to be saints, Papal Envoy Cardinal Marcello Semeraro noted that their martyrdom came as a, quote, gesture of hospitality and care, of mercy. We remember the Ulmas today and the model that they give to us of these virtues. Secondly, I want to ask that you join me in a moment of silence. For several weeks now, our attention has been directed in a more intense way to the land of Israel and Gaza, and even as we gather here, there are those who are suffering there. So let's now take just a moment of silence to remember them. Thank you so much. As I said, I want to turn the program over for a moment to my colleague Arthur Urbano, chair of our committee, before I take the mic back to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Holly, and good evening, everyone. I'm Arthur Urbano, professor of theology and chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee at Providence College, and I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the committee, those of you who are in person in Rouen and those of you joining us on Zoom, to tonight's lecture by our inaugural Scholar-in-Residence in Jewish Studies and Jewish-Christian Relations, Dr. Benny Bar-Lavi. This is a significant moment in the intellectual, educational, even spiritual life of Providence College. As Holly mentioned, and as many of you know, the Scholar-in-Residence position is the result of more than a decade of work by the JCTE committee, the theology department, and the college. The purpose of the position is to invite to the college scholars in different areas of Jewish studies who are committed to interreligious dialogue in order to advance the mission of the JCTE and the college to foster interreligious learning and dialogue through intellectual engagement and personal encounter. In addition to teaching, the Scholar-in-Residence also coordinates outreach activities for the campus and local communities. This semester, I have the good fortune of teaching a course on Jewish-Christian relations with Dr. Bar-Lavi. And he and I will offer a similar course for the community next semester in collaboration with the Delve Deeper program, an educational initiative sponsored by a consortium of local synagogues. Benny has a lot of other great ideas too, and if I tried to mention them all, I'd be giving the lecture tonight. So we've got a lot of good things ahead of us. The inauguration of the scholar-in-residence position is also a significant part of the college's historical commitment to forming bonds of collaboration and friendship with the local Jewish community. A commitment that goes back to 1932, believe it or not, over 90 years, when Providence College, under the leadership of then-President Father Lorenzo McCarthy, co-hosted a gathering of the newly formed National Conference of Christians and Jews in partnership with the Diocese of Providence and Brown University. This was also an era when the college opened its doors to local Jewish students, many of whom lived in the Smith Hill neighborhood. And this was just the beginning of that history. You can learn more about it by checking out an exhibit now on display in the library called Kindred Spirits, a legacy of Catholic Jewish interfaith advocacy at PC. For those of you not familiar with the campus, the library is just the next building over and is open tonight until midnight. So there's plenty of time to go to the reception and stop in afterwards. So finally, just some housekeeping. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available on our website, jews-catholic.providence.edu. You can also learn more about the work of the JCTE there and make a gift to help us continue this important work of interreligious engagement. After Dr. Bar-Lavi's lecture, there will be time for questions from both the in-person and Zoom audience. For those of you on Zoom, I invite you to place your questions in the Q&A feature at any time over the course of the evening. And my colleague, Father Dominic, will field and present those questions. And for those of you in person, Holly will be there to pass around the mic. And please do remember to speak directly into the mic so that the Zoom audience can hear you. And with that, I will turn things back over to Holly, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Arthur. As Arthur mentioned, Benny Bar-Lavi is our inaugural Scholar-in-Residence in Jewish Studies and Jewish Christian Relations at Providence College. Dr. Bar-Lavi received his PhD in history from the University of Chicago, where he also served as a postdoctoral fellow in the social sciences. He is an intellectual historian, focusing on early modern political theology, the Western Sephardic diaspora, and early modern Spain. His current book project, titled Politics Against God, Judaism and Islam in the Political Theological Discourses of Early Modernity, examines how Judaism and Islam became protagonists in the debates surrounding politics and religion that shook Europe during the early modern period. His scholarship has been supported by the Association for Jewish Studies, the European Research Council, the Political Theology Network, the Joyce C. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies, and the Division of Social Sciences at the University of Chicago. His lecture to us, is titled Ungodly Statecraft, Figural Judaism and the Critique of Desacralized Politics in 16th and 17th century Europe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benny Bar-Lavi.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Arthur, for your introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time, as you know. And first of all, I'd like to offer my gratitude to all of you for coming. I also take the opportunity to extend a special thanks to the outstanding intellectual community here at Providence College for their hospitality, their generosity, and indeed their friendship in these times. It's been a great privilege to be the Inaugural Scholar-in-Residence in Jewish Studies and Jewish Christian Relations. Now, the plan for me is to speak about 45 minutes, after which I look forward to answering your questions and any comments that you have. So let's get started. Arthur, could you please go to the next slide. Arthur is going to take care of the... Can you hear me better? Good. So I'd like to open by providing you with a short passage that I think encapsulates rather well the subject matter of this lecture. It's from a 1591 treatise composed in Latin by a Belgian theologian by the name of Pierre Corret. The title is very long. Back in those days, titles were really long, so I'm just going to give you part of it. It's Defense of the Truth Against the Assertions of Those Who Attack the Catholic Faith. Now, here it goes. Those rulers who seek to establish political leadership while disregarding the Christian religion are very similar to the Jews, who, being desirous of glory and temporal advantages, decided to kill Christ, the author of eternal salvation. They are willing for flocks to exercise dominion over shepherds, chariots over charioteers, and the spirit over the flesh, for they contend against nature and the divine law by which Christ orders the kingdom of God to be sought first. Now, the treatise, it should be pointed out, was not directed against Jews. I cannot emphasize this. This is crucial. Rather, it was directed against the Huguenots, that is, the French Protestants. However, least we think that this was a specifically Catholic phenomenon. That's not the case. Protestants, too, accused Catholics of political Judaizing, and in fact, every single Christian confession at the time accused virtually every other confession of political Judaizing. So this is a pan-European, pan-confessional phenomenon well beyond early modern Europe, and in a sense until today. Now, why was this the case? So in this lecture, I would like to delve into this topic, try to give some answers. And this has been a topic that has been the focus of my research for the last years, namely the figural role of Judaism in the self-identified Christian political thought of early modern Europe. Now, this is a very long sentence. Let's try to unpack it. What do I mean by figural Judaism? What do I mean by self-identified Christian political thought? Let's start with Christian political thought. And when I say Christian, I think we should take this with a grain of salt. The term in its different variations will be used exclusively as it was used by those early modern Europeans who A, identified as Christians, whether Catholic, Protestant, doesn't matter, and B, asserted that their political theory, whatever that happened to be, represented the true and proper Christian approach to politics. Now, the possibility of a Christian politics has been vigorously disputed by no less an important figure as Augustine, who held that, at least in his old age, that all politics in this world takes place under the sign of Cain, and that the idea of a political theology that is a politics grounded on transcendence is baseless in Christian thought. Now, of course, throughout history, there have been vigorous disagreements about Christians about what a Christian politics should look like, what are its foundations, what are its goals, who is the sovereign, and what are the limits of that sovereignty. And these disagreements continue to this day. I mean, just think about the generations following World War II in Catholic economic thought and in questions of social justice within the Catholic Church, to give you an idea. So the notion of a Christian political theology cannot be confined to any era. However, the very public challenges that were faced by this self-identified Christian politics in the 16th and 17th centuries were novel and, in a sense, revolutionary. One of these challenges was the mass dissemination of claims about the supremacy of political expediency over moral concerns and over theological considerations, a notion that was and is primarily associated, rightly or wrongly, with Machiavelli. And while such ideas may not have been unprecedented in the history of the Christian West, think, for example, of Marsilius of Padua and his Defensor Pacis, or Pacis, as I've been taught to say in ecclesiastical Latin, the reaction caused by the very public and widespread diffusion of these ideas would transform the political discourse in unprecedented ways. This was the case not only because of the well-known influence of Machiavelli's thought, but also because of the less discussed hostile reception to Machiavelli as a symbol of political godlessness. Think, for example, of the difference between communism as an idea, an ideology, and the Red Scare during the 50s. This was sort of what was going on at the time with Machiavelli. The idea of Machiavelli was very, very scary to everyone, whether or not this was related to the real Machiavelli. Now, there was, of course, a concurrent phenomenon whose impact on the political and religious thought of early modern Europe is difficult to overestimate, and that's, of course, the Protestant Reformation, along with its intended and unintended consequences, which irreparably fractioned the realm of sacred politics while reformulating the functions of secular and religious authority for all confessions, Protestant, Catholic, Anglican, Calvinist, what have you. New questions about the nature of political authority, along with its proper relationship to the divine, were being asked across Christendom, while each denomination accused others of heresy and godlessness. Now, these twin challenges, the propagation of godless politics and the fracturing of Europe's theological unity, would produce new ways of thinking about the relationships between politics and religion. Now, much of what I've been telling you so far is more or less known to historians of early modern political thought and intellectual historians. Yet, as I will argue in this talk, there's a fundamental dimension that has been absent from the pages of this history, and that is the crucial role played by Judaism as a figure of desacralization in the political, theological discourses of early modern Europe. What do I mean now by figural Judaism? Figural first, in that we're not dealing with any real Jews here. These are not the flesh and blood Jews of Europe, and this is not a talk about their history. And I will not talk to you about today about the ways in which Christians and Jews interacted or about the history of anti-Semitism. And I hope I'm not disappointing anyone. But rather, I'm going to focus on something completely different but no less interesting or important, namely the critical role of Jews and Judaism as ideas, as concepts at the very heart of Western thought, as tools with which to formulate worldviews and make sense of a changing world that, for the most part, had little or no contact with living Jews as a religion or as a people. Now, this is something I think it's worth considering. Jews in Western Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries were either non-existent or a minuscule minority. I mean, by the 16th century, Jews had been expelled from Spain, England, France, Portugal, many other smaller states throughout the Holy Roman Empire, cities in Italy. Nevertheless, the role played by Jews in Judaism as a signifier of political theological error and as the antithesis of a self-identified Christian politics is nothing short of astonishing. Another point worth mentioning is that such figural thinking about Judaism has often had very little to do with any accurate depictions of Judaism or of the practices of living Jews. And perhaps most importantly, this figural Judaism need not, and indeed was usually not, directed at Jews or at people who bore any relation to Judaism, whether conversos or whether former Jews or what have you, as seen by the example below. All theological notions of deicide, of supersession, of an undue attachment to the flesh, of slavery to the law, spiritual blindness acquired new political meanings as a prevailing theological critique of Judaism metamorphosed into a political theological critique of the European self. By European self, I mean European Christians. We're, again, not dealing here with Jews or with Muslims or with the colonial or anything like that. I'm talking about European Christians here. So that new concepts and new terms of opprobrium, such as Protestant, Papist, reason of state, Machiavellian, politics, religious freedom, all of this became identified with Judaism. So Judaism was recast as the preeminent representative of a godless politics, and perhaps more importantly, as a conceptual antipode that must be overcome and superseded in order for a truly Christian politics to emerge. This is a crucial aspect that I think has been much misunderstood, and it's precisely here that my research has tried to intervene. Now, let's see some concrete examples here. Next slide, please, Arthur. Next slide. Thank you. Let's start with a famous figure here, Erasmus of Rotterdam, the foremost humanist of the Northern Renaissance. Now, few concepts, if any, played a more important role in Erasmus' famed pacifism than Judaism. The most prominent example is arguably found in his Querela Pacis, or Pacis, again, ecclesiastical Latin. The famous Complaint of Peace, spurned and rejected by the whole world from 1517. This is a classic text of pacifism to this day. It deploys a Pauline theological dichotomy between Jew and Christian as a way of critiquing war. Now, war and peace join earthly and heavenly, flesh and spirit, law and faith, human and divine, as yet another additional binary of opposition that is represented by Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other. Erasmus says, and I'm quoting here, "There is a great difference between the God of the Jews and the God of the Christians, even though by his very nature he is the same God. For while vengeance of the Jewish God produces bloody slaughters, the vengeance of the Christian God ought to be interpreted as, and I quote, the tearing of the wicked inclinations of the heart," end quote. And while Moses' teachings, that is the Torah, the Jewish religion, is characterized as harsh and bloodthirsty, Christ is said to have, quote, expounded but peace, end quote. So Erasmus interpreted earthly violence of the Old Testament as a prefiguration of the inner spiritual battle against the vices of the New Testament. So concepts like Lord of Hosts and Lords of Vengeance are thus not to be taken literally. These are hermeneutical errors that are quintessentially Jewish, and as illustrated by the Jewish deafness to the angelic song of peace, followed by the birth of Christ. I'm going to read this. When Christ was born, the angels sound trumpets of war. The Jews heard the noise of the trumpet, for they were permitted to wage war, and this was the appropriate sign for men whose law told them to hate their enemies. But the angels of peace sing a very different song in the ears of a people seeking peace. They do not sound war trumpets or promise victories, triumphs, and spoils of war. No. It is peace they proclaim in accordance with the pronouncements of the prophets, and they proclaim it not to those who breathe war and slaughter, who are filled with fury and longing for arms, but to men of good will whose inclination is towards concord. Now, this passage obviously is an allusion to the second chapter of Luke, verse 14. However, the statements about the Jews' bellicosity and their hermeneutical deafness to this song of peace as trumpets of war do not appear anywhere in the New Testament. These are additions by Erasmus. Now, Erasmus notes that these Judaizing violence and this hermeneutical deafness can, in certain cases, be overcome. So it's not all lost, as indeed was the case with Paul the Apostle, who, quote, found serenity after his change from the violence of Saul and taught the value of peace when he made love the greatest of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. However, this transformation is a very, very difficult task, according to Erasmus, as is shown by another apostle, Peter, who initially failed to overcome his Judaism during the arrest of Jesus. So rather than follow the example of Jesus, whose love of peace was able to reconcile Pilate and Herod, Peter is portrayed as, quote, still have Jew, in Latin, ad hoc semi Judaeum, as he was prepared to defend his Lord and Master at the risk of his own life. But Christ rebuked him for this and bade him to put up his sword. So Erasmus' critique, lest we forget, was not directed against any literal Jew. As mentioned, Jews were few and far between in early modern Western Europe, and certainly they didn't fight wars or even carry weapons at the time. Rather, Erasmus is emphatically pointing his finger at his fellow Christians, whose bloodthirsty warmongering is understood as a form of political Judaizing. Next slide, please, Arthur. But as I said, this was not a phenomenon that was confined to one specific confession here in Europe, and Erasmus was far from unique in this. Martin Luther, despite all of his temperamental and theological differences with Erasmus, read his biography and you'll see what I'm talking about, also deployed Judaism as a protagonist in his critique of earthly politics. Now, whereas Catholic political thought in the 16th century sought to sanctify politics, Luther advocated a radical separation of the sacred and the secular, the famous doctrine of the two kingdoms. One of the most lucid formulations of this doctrine can be found in his lecture on Galatians from 1535, which, by the way, is in Latin. Luther also wrote in Latin, not only German. And here Luther interprets Galatians, the second chapter of Galatians, verse 14, in which Paul employs the term Judaizing for the first time. And he says, I'm quoting, "Whoever knows how to properly distinguish the gospel from the law should give thanks to God and know that he's a true theologian. This conflation," and end quote, "this conflation constitutes a theological and political error of the first magnitude." This conflation. Nothing quite exemplifies it as Judaism. So in Luther's theology, the law of the kingdom of the world, which stands in opposition to Christ's salvific grace in the kingdom of heaven, is typified by the Jewish law of Moses. And I quote here, "Christ is not Moses, not a taskmaster or a lawgiver. He is dispenser of grace. The highest art among Christians is to be able to define Christ this way. It is also the most difficult of arts." And of particular importance for our purposes, Luther held that this law, meaning the Mosaic law, the Jewish law, represents not only the superseded ritual and religious precepts of the stubborn Jews who failed to accept Christ, but also the judicial, the civil, and the tyrannical laws upon which all politics are based, inevitably. And as Luther explains in his exposition of Galatians, in government, politia, obedience to the law must be strictly required. Let there nothing be known about the gospel, but let there be knowledge only of Moses, of the law and his works. When these two topics, law and gospel, are separated this way, both will remain within their limits. The law will remain outside heaven, and on the other hand, the freedom of the gospel will remain outside earth. And just as soon as the law and sin come into heaven, that is, into the conscience, they should be promptly ejected. On the other hand, when grace and freedom come into earth, that is, into the body, you must say, "You have no business here among the dirt and filth and this physical life. You belong in heaven." This critique of such Judaizing eruption of earthly law into heavenly affairs, along with the equally Judaizing expectation that divine grace partake in political affairs, is absolutely foundational to Luther's thought. This conflation of the two kingdoms became one of Luther's most powerful polemical leitmotifs against his theological and political enemies, chief among them the Catholic Church and Catholic kingdoms and everything that is basically Catholic. Or as Luther would famously call it, the Pope's synagogue, or the synagogue of Satan. These are words that Luther uses for the Catholic Church. This Judaizing equivocation of religion and politics was not only employed by Luther in his attacks of the Catholic Church, as can be seen in his famous About the Jews and Their Lies. This one is in German, is Von der Juden und ihre Lügen, composed in 1543. According to Luther, the Jews hated Christ and crucified him not because he constituted a political threat, a claim that we will hear again later on by the Catholic anti-Machiavellians, but precisely because he was politically powerless. Next slide, please, Arthur. So according to Luther, the chief priests of rulers and their followers took offense at the person of Christ, since he did not appear as a mighty king, but wander around about as a poor beggar. The Jews hoped that now, after the loss of the scepter, Shiloh had come. But the chief priests, the rulers, and the followers took offense at the person, since he did not appear as a mighty king. And I go down. When they were disappointed in these expectations, the noble blood and circumcised saints were vexed as people who had the promise of the kingdom and could not attain it through this beggar. Therefore, they despised him and did not accept him. So Christ, in other words, according to Luther, was a disappointment. And sure enough, the Jews had him crucified, quote, as ignominiously as possible. But this was not the end of the story. Earthly Jewish political ambition could not be quenched by the messianic disappointment of the crucifixion, and not even by the consequent defeat at the hands of the Roman legions who destroyed the Second Temple. The worldly fixation with political messianism would ultimately lead the Jews to produce a, quote, Messiah fashioned to their liking and their mind in the figure of Shimon Bar Kokhba. This false Messiah was chosen by, quote, a rabbi or Talmudist named Akiba, a very learned man, esteemed by the Jews more highly than all the other rabbis, end quote, with explicit intention of gaining earthly power and doing away with both Christians and Romans. And this rabbi, Rabbi Akiba, the supreme spiritual leader of the Jews, became a prophet, a guardsman to Bar Kokhba, the secular and worldly Messiah. Luther goes on to tell how Bar Kokhba was vanquished by the Romans, and the prophet was, Rabbi Akiba was slain and tortured. However, Judaism did not learn his lesson. Christ was still not accepted, and the Jews have persisted in their hermeneutical crucifixion of Scripture down to Luther's day. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this worldly Messiah, this Rabbi Akiba, according to Luther, was a prefiguration of a contemporary of Luther, that is Thomas Müntzer. Now, while at first, you probably know this, Müntzer was attracted to Luther's ideas of reform. The two would ultimately clash over theological matters, not least Münzer's apocalyptic belief in the inevitable conquest of the earthly government by the common people in the name of God, a people's theocracy, if you will. Müntzer would go on to support the Peasants' Revolt, becoming its chaplain, and according to Luther, its prophet, even assuming the command of local troops. And according to Luther, Rabbi Akiba, much like Müntzer, assumed the military task of guardsman, of arms bearer, and ultimately both the Peasants' Revolt and the Jewish Revolt were quashed, after which both Akiba and Müntzer were captured, tortured, and executed. So for Luther, a fierce opponent, again, of the Peasants' Revolt, both Akiba and Müntzer, and both Judaism and other forms of Protestantism, were guilty of that quintessentially Jewish tendency of politicizing religion. Let's go back to Catholics, now that we've talked about Protestants. Next slide, please, Arthur. Thank you. So the next example, let's switch gears now to a different part of Europe, different language now, and different confession, Catholic Spain at the end of the 16th century. In 1595, Pedro de Rivadeneira, one of the foremost nonfiction writers of the Spanish Gold Age, published a work, again with a very long title, a treatise on the religion and virtues that a Christian prince must possess to govern and conserve his realms against that which Niccolo Machiavelli and the politicians of this age teach. The title was so long that the book became known as simply The Christian Prince, presumably as an antithetical reference to Machiavelli's unchristian prince. It was the first systematization of a political theological worldview that would come to dominate Spanish thought in the coming generations, that a view that defined itself as a Christian, quote-unquote, politics, a true reason of state as opposed to a false reason of state, and the alternative to Tacitus, to Bodin, and above all, to the pernicious and atheistic politics of Machiavelli. So The Christian Prince was the first work in Spanish to associate Judaism, and also Islam to a lesser extent, with the novel and pernicious idea of a false reason of state of Machiavellianism. Rivadeneira invokes the language of theology while doing this. He uses terms such as sect, heresy, error, enmity of God to identify and critique these new political discourse. that is Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is described as an impious and godless man, a minister of Satan, who spread a diabolical doctrine even more pernicious than the Protestants ravaging Europe. And his followers are a sect, the sect of the politicians, the most abominable of all heresies. They came out of hell, and it goes on and on and on with these terms of opprobrium. Their godless politics would lead to perdition, not only in heaven, but also here on earth as well. And in conscious contrast to Machiavelli, Ribadeneira argues that a careful study of history offers proof that failing to take into account the divine providential dimension of politics is a recipe for disaster. And according to this interpretation of history, politics is by its very essence theological, which is pretty much the opposite of what we just heard from Luther. The power and the being of earthly rulers, Ribadeneira argues, partakes of the divine being and power. So any statecraft that is separated from the law of God is not, properly speaking, a statecraft. And it's precisely for this reason that politicians are unworthy of the name, meaning atheist politicians, because only a believing politician will be able to understand history and its dynamics. And this is crucial because history was a hermeneutical battleground with which a Christian political theology triumphed over Machiavellianism. The extensive and the incessant appeals to history go well beyond any rhetorical considerations. This is first and foremost an attempt to beat the enemies of Christian politics or their own game. That is, by empirically refuting them. Why am I telling you all of this? Because there is one historical incident that plays an archetypical role in Ribadeneira's critique of earthly politics. And that is the old accusation of deicide. This is Ribadeneira's rendition of the events narrated in the 11th chapter of John 11, in which the Pharisees and the princes of the Jews plot to kill Christ. And I'm going to read sections of it. What do we do? Why are we still asleep? Can you not see the many miracles performed by this man? If we leave him be and not tie his hands, surely the entire world will believe in him. The Romans will come against our city, seizing it, destructing it, and so on and so forth. And I jump, and so it was by resorting to a false reason of state that the Pharisees and the princes of the Jews decided to take away the life of the author of life. Now, pay close attention. What did they gain from this? What benefit came from such a counsel? Christ died on the cross, and through his most blessed passion, the entire world believed in him. In retribution for his death, God commanded the Romans to lay siege to the city, crush it, and breach its walls, leaving not a single stone standing. The Jews suffered one of the most severe and dreadful punishments in the world, as documented in the histories of this event. So by pursuing the path they believed would safeguard their city, they ultimately lost it. The advice they followed, driven by a reason of state against God, became their destruction and their dagger. Now, according to Ribadeneira's remarkable interpretation, the Jewish failure to accept Christ as God and Messiah constituted not only a grave theological error, but first and foremost a political error. By failing to recognize the divine dimension of politics, the princes of the Jews, as Ribadeneira refers to them, were not only guilty of deicide, but they were committing the greatest political blunder in human history. Nowhere, I think, in both Ribadeneira's Christian prints or indeed in perhaps all of the anti-Machiavellian Catholic writings of the Spanish Golden Age, can we find an episode of comparable rhetorical, pedagogical, or theoretical magnitude. The deployment of the old accusation of deicide into a political theological key became a recurring motif of the Spanish anti-Machiavellian tradition, as well as the works of giants of Spanish literature, such as Calderón de la Barca and many others. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on one of this, which is Francisco de Quevedo, to which we'll now turn our attention. Next slide, please, Arthur. Again, I don't know how well known Quevedo is among English speakers, but he was a giant of Spanish poetry. a novelist, politician, master satirist, and one of the foremost poets of the Spanish Golden Age. This is an understatement. He was renowned for his metaphors, poetry of conceits, paradoxical images, all of which can be appreciated in his most important political work, entitled Politics of God, Government of Christ, written during the first half of the 17th century between 1617 and 1635, a book that became very popular at the time. This book was intended as a blueprint for an ideal system, a statecraft modeled on Christianity, at any rate as Quevedo understood this. And its central argument in a nutshell is that the political and the divine spheres are intertwined, even analogous. Again, the opposite of what Luther thought. And of course, the greatest enemy of this is Machiavelli, whose name Quevedo associates with the usual terms of abuse, politics, atheism, tyranny, so on and so forth. And all of this is a part of this huge cosmic battle over humanity. On the one hand, you have the infernal politics, and on the other hand, you have the politics of God. And Judaism, not surprisingly, is representative of the former, of the infernal politics. And like Ribadeneira, Quevedo derived valuable political lessons from the events surrounding the quote-unquote Jewish plot to kill Jesus, the deicide accusations. And I read here the second part. Quevedo talks about how the Jews mocked Christ and led him to his death and so on and so forth. And then I read, they, the Jews, have eyes but not prophecy. They deprive kings of what they have and advise them to make use of what they have not. The Jews covered Christ's eyes but could not take away his sight, which penetrates the depths of hell. It is well known that the Jews are the ones who are blind. The danger, sir, is that if the kings of this earth let their eyes be covered, they will not be able to recognize those who slapped them and spit at them. They cannot see nor recognize those. They govern by groping. They live in the dark. And now pay attention. All bad ministers are disciples of these Jews and these princes. Now, who are these bad ministers that he's talking about? Obviously not Jews. This is a very thinly veiled allusion to the very high-ranking administration of Philip III. I don't know if you heard, the Duke of Alba. So he's basically criticizing probably the most powerful person in Spain after the king by basically saying that he's a disciple of the Jews. He's politically Judaizing. And by asserting that all bad ministers are disciples of Jews, Quevedo is implying that all politics runs the risk of Judaizing, and that all political actors, including Catholic ministers of His Most Catholic Majesty, run the risk of becoming Jews. Now, further down, next slide, please, Arthur. Again, we continue this description of Pontius Pilate and the trial and so on and so forth. Pilate took pride in being a great politician. He would pursue dissimulation and incredulity, this being the two eyes of atheism. The Jews knew this about him, and so, due to their hindermost diligence against Christ, tempted him with reason of state. Reason of state was a very recent term, but the Jews were using it back then, saying, if you let this one go, you are no friend of Caesar, for anyone who claims to be a king contradicts Caesar. As soon as Pilate heard the word Caesar, that he would be an enemy of him, he sent Christ to his death. It is therefore, sir, that the most efficient means ever devised against Christ, through God and man, was reason of state. And again, I emphasize, reason of state was a concept that was at least popularized and became very important only in the 16th century. So again, we find accusations of deicide by reason of state. Quevedo goes on to explain that it was due to the Jewish political concern that reason of state, quote, began persecuting and condemning Christ. Next slide, please, Arthur. Perhaps a last example here. I'm going to jump to the second paragraph. The pontifices, that is the Sadducees, okay, and the Pharisees were gathered in the meeting, the plot to kill Christ, committee and council, for it was one of the gravest matters that had ever taken place, in which the most important matter that had ever was and will be was discussed. If this was taught by Caiaphas, many have learned it. They keep the name Caiaphas silent, yet they utter his doctrine. If in this council such things happened, it is to be feared that they will happen in others. The man named Caiaphas is no more, but there will always be men to whom this name may be given. Now, the potency of the political theology we have encountered throughout this talk is adroitly encapsulated in Quevedo's discussion, I think, of the deicide of Christ. And it lies precisely in its capacity to Judaize all political power, such that every politician is suspended between Judaism and Christianity with the possibility to adopt either of them. And again, according to this very powerful use of Pauline logic, all political actors, again, risk incurring the sin of political Judaizing. Now, all of these would have momentous consequences for Christians, Jews, and Muslims and their descendants in early modern Europe and beyond, but this is a topic for a different talk. Next slide, please, Arthur. So I want to say some concluding words about what we have just seen and some of the, I think, implications and changes that have happened in our time. Now, the aim of these examples that I've just shared with you was to show the pan-European and pan-confessional presence of Figural Judaism. There are countless other examples, believe me, in other languages and confessions. This is the proverbial tip of the iceberg. But again, what is perhaps most fascinating is the omnipresence of Judaism in the way Western Europe and its offshoots understood politics, precisely at a time in which, as I said, Jews were, for the most part, absent from Europe, Judenrein, if you wish, not to mention politically powerless and marginalized. However, by way of conclusion, I'd like to dwell on some of the important implications and observations that maybe we can learn from this talk, especially with regards to the future of Christian thinking about politics. And this is important, I think. First of all, it's crucial to note that there is nothing inevitably anti-Judaic in Christianity or in a Christian approach to politics. The use of Judaism as an archetype of godly statecraft need not be an essential property of a Christian approach to politics. To put it in Aristotelian terms, Figural Judaism that we've talked about here is not an essential element of Christianity. It need not be an essential element of Christianity. If we want to use more modern terms, it's a bug. It's not a feature of Christianity, or at least it need not be. And I mean, think about it. Erasmus could have grounded his Christian pacifist theories without having to deploy Judaism as the ultimate signifier of war, right? Luther could have rooted his arguments about the Christian importance of separating religion from the pernicious effect of politics without having to portray Judaism as the archetype of politicized religion. Ribadenera, the Spanish author, and Quevedo could have provided a compelling Christian critique of what they held to be nihilistic politics, devoid of ethics and devoid of any concern for theology, without having to transpose the old accusation of deicide into an anti-Machiavellian key in which the Jews become consummate Machiavellians 15 centuries before the birth of Machiavelli. Nevertheless, they all relied, as if compelled by necessity, to use Judaism as a typology for godless statecraft and as a foil and an antipode to their respective political theologies. As I've tried to explain, though, much of that can be traced to the role of Judaism in the theologies from which they drew upon and from which they built their political theories. But what happens when we have theologies that seek to de-emphasize the role of Judaism as a conceptual antipode? Theologies in which Judaism is not portrayed as rejected or accursed, theologies that strive to do away with heart supersessionism, accusations of deicide, and at the same time reject the hostility toward flesh and blood, real ontological Jews, theologies that, in other words, actively strive to overcome the old habit of thinking with Judaism, the old anti-Judaic habits of thought, so that polemic no longer exists, And to quote Rosemary Rutner, anti-Judaic polemic no longer exists as the left hand of a Christological hermeneutic. And I would like to end this talk on a cautiously optimistic note regarding the future of Christian political thought in our time, in Nostra Aetate, which is, I'm sure all of you know this, it's Latin for in our time, the official declaration of the Second Vatican Council promulgated in 1965, dealing with the relationship of the church with non-Christian religions, most prominently Judaism. Much has been written about the momentous change that Nostra Aetate, as well as similar theological statements influenced by it, both within the Catholic Church and in other Christian denominations, have had upon Jewish-Christian relations. But I think there's an additional aspect that is perhaps less explored, and that's the possibility that Nostra Aetate opens for the future of Christian thinking about politics. Because some people like it or not, but the fact is that the attempt to ground political action on divine revelation will continue to play a role in the way we theorize about the proper way of ordering human affairs. And so there will continue to be Christian thinkers for whom politics cannot and must not be desacralized, for whom religion must continue to play a guiding role in the ways we humans live as political animals. But there's a crucial difference this time, I think, in that the era ushered by Nostra Aetate has significantly improved the prospects of such a Christian approach to politics, and in particular a Catholic approach to politics, in which Jews and Judaism are no longer cast in the role of political theological error, of figural antipodes of Christianity, and of enemies of God. And last slide, Arthur, please. And this, I believe, is a cause for much needed optimism in difficult times such as ours. But this is a topic for a different lecture, and maybe we'll do it. Anyway, thank you once again for your presence tonight, and I very much look forward to your questions and suggestions.
We have a few moments remaining for questions.
And I believe we have a tradition, if we can, of giving a student our first question.
You have that tradition. Students.
Oh,
Sold.
sorry. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm just going to, I just want to make a disclaimer here. This question is in completely good faith. It's not supposed to offend. So what I got from it is that Judaism was wrongfully assumed to be analogous to Machiavellianism, right? But I just want to understand that Christians usually, Christians assign metaphor to everything. I think you can make that generalization that Christians usually assign metaphor to everything. Like with Augustine, he assigned a lot of metaphor to the Gospels. He saw in the parables, he thought that some stuff was supposed to be interpreted analogously. And I don't think it would be a wrong generalization to say that Christianity is generally a figurative, it interprets a lot of things figuratively. And I think it certainly would not be extreme to say that it interprets things figuratively, the Bible, a lot more than Judaism does. Would you agree with that?
I think both religions use this sort of figural interpretation, and in a sense, Christianity this was shared with Judaism. This is something that actually Christianity and Judaism share, this tendency to interpret things figuratively. However, the role of figural Judaism in Christianity is very important. That doesn't mean that it has to be anti-Judaic, and that doesn't mean that Christianity is inevitably an anti-Semitic religion, not at all. But it is something that has been present throughout its history. But yeah, sorry.
Do you think it's possible though for Christians, just people in general, not Christians, to see metaphors like what I say, see generalizations, see resemblances, not just in Judaism to other things, but Christians to other things as well. Is it possible for a Christian, a regular person, to see a metaphor or see resemblance in Judaism to another thing, and for it not to be a hasty generalization or anti-Semitic? Would that be possible? Like, for example, what I just said there, that Jews have a tendency. I mean, you see with the Talmud, right? The Talmud is a very literal text. It isn't supposed to be interpreted figuratively. Is that right? I have a limited understanding of Judaism, but is that right generally?
So again, the role of Judaism in the political thought of Christianity at this time, and indeed throughout Christian thought, has been very, very, very central in this way. It's not just something anecdotal. It's at the very core of the way in which Christianity has sought to deal with the world and to make sense of the world. But again, that doesn't mean that it has to be a negative role, and that doesn't mean that it has to be deployed in the way that it has been deployed in this sense. I don't know if this answers you.
Yeah, let me just finish it up. Just ask the question. Do you think it is possible to make analogies, make analogies between Judaism and other things, or Christianity and other things, without being overtly anti-Semitic or negative? Do you think that is possible, or do you think we should just avoid any analogies, metaphors, whatever, between certain things?
No, analogies can be made, but the question is, what are those analogies doing and how are those analogies deployed? If the analogy of deicide is used as the most perfect example of Machiavellian politics, then that's one thing. If you're using different analogies for different things, that's another thing. But the problem here has been the centrality and the power of these analogies.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was like Machiavellianism to Judaism, a terrible analogy. I agree. Yeah.
Let me. Oh yeah. Do you
We
have
do have a couple
Zoom
of
question?
questions on Zoom. I see 3. So,
pick the best one?
oh well, I'm not sure I can choose that, but okay. So this one is a kind of follow-up, I suppose, of sorts to this last question. So, the question is, so thank you for a fascinating talk. This is from, pardon my pronunciation, Davida Charney. Thank you for a fascinating talk. You describe how completely antithetical theologians and philosophers all resort to an image of Jews to model the wrong way to do politics. Did anyone recognize these views of Jews were contradictory? Did they argue over what Jews were really like? Was that a question that anyone was asking?
So the short answer is that they did note that this is contradictory, but they always accuse the other side of not understanding what Jews are in this sense. So Protestants and Catholics and others were aware of this tension, but it was always part of the bad theology on their other side and bad hermeneutics, that they don't really understand what it means to be politically Judaizing.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, someone have a question? Oh, you have a question.
Father, I think we can take one more question. Arthur suggests that we end at 6 o'clock, so.
Stay around for.
Okay. Some of this material is very unfamiliar to me, but you argued very forcefully that people's conceptions of, Judaism, Jewish politics were, inimical to Christian thought. But my question is there such a thing that you could tell us that would be the proper understanding? Is there a Jewish political philosophy, historically, culturally, that you could give us that was positive in place of this negative one?
That's a very good question, but that's for another talk. But I will give you, Judaism was used as a model in different cases But even here, there is nothing that is consistent, as it were. It was used as a justification for monarchy throughout the Spanish Empire, and it was used as a justification for republicanism during England in the 17th century. So even this, it's really hard to sort of characterize. This is part of the reason that we're dealing here with Scripture, and Scripture has an endless possibility of being interpreted. Both Scripture and both the rabbinical writings. So there's not one way in which Judaism was employed, even when employed positively.
Great.
Oh, Jews themselves. That's another topic, but we'll talk about it. I promise.
I think we will have to end there, but two important things before we go. First, you are very heartily welcomed and invited to join us for a reception in the Great Room, which is this direction and up one floor, where it's also very possible that we continue our conversation and even with questions. And I offer Benny to you for questions for the next hour or two. With that in mind, would you please join me in thanking him once more?